Okay, so we're here with Father Thomas Joseph White, Rector of the Angelicum, member of the Dominican Order, who's going to be speaking at our conference in 2022. And so Father White here, he's just going to, just give us a wee bit of an insight, just, what he thinks about, having been to Ireland before, what he thinks of the timeliness of the conference and what he's going to speak at the conference. So, Father Thomas, you're very welcome. And I understand you've been to Ireland before several times and you've spoken at several academic events. Just what's your impression of Ireland, and are you looking forward to return to Ireland?
Well, let me say two things. First, as a person who's a member of the Catholic religious tradition, obviously Ireland has its own really unique and enduring Catholic intellectual spiritual heritage. And you really feel that. I've spent a lot of my time in France, in England, in Italy, and Germany. And so I've seen other expressions of Christian intellectual and cultural tradition. And when you come to Ireland, you really sense the depth and the sort of pervasive influence of a distinctive ancient Christian tradition and its contemporary resonances. The second thing I'd say is in Ireland, you also sense the acute question of religious belief and faith in the world today. Everyone knows that the faith has been massively contested culturally in Ireland in the past, let's say, 2 generations. And you sense how vivid a question it is. I mean, in a way, a deeply emotional, but also, I would say, a deeper intellectual, existential tension is manifest in the culture. I wouldn't say in an unpleasant way, but I would say in a living kind of tangible way. And in a lot of young people who I've encountered in academic contexts, principally in Dublin, not exclusively, you can sense that the need to explain or understand intellectually the stance of religious disposition today is acute. And that's an opportunity, not just a challenge. It's not just a negative thing. It's also a positive thing. There's a kind of a sense of a cultural agency, a sense of cultural responsibility on the part of young Christian intellectuals to bring their faith into public manifestation and self-explanation in a certain way.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings us nicely to the next point, because the theme of the conference is the future of Christian thinking. So it's going to be philosophers, philosophically informed theologians such as yourself coming along and contributing to the theme for the conference. So do you feel that this is a timely sort of theme to address at an international academic conference situated here in Ireland, just outside of Dublin? Maynooth is just a half-hour drive from Dublin.
Obviously, Dublin represents symbolically a little bit the secular option in the Irish horizon of contemporary, cultural life in Ireland. But, let's just expand out from there. I think European Christianity is in an interesting crossroads. And I'd say that's also true in many respects of American Christianity, because the cultural inertia is breaking down. And so it has begun to become a countercultural decision to be a practicing Christian in Ireland and in North America in a way that I think it already has been for a generation or two in, say, France or Spain. But there's something in let's just call it generally the Anglo-Saxon philosophical culture that is more accepting of speaking about this issue in public, maybe not on university campuses as much, and philosophy departments on secular university campuses, which often have a kind of gentleman's agreement not to talk about God in public. But I mean, in terms of the larger sort of, I'd say, energy that you see on the East Coast of the United States or in Ireland or England, there is a kind of open intellectual conversation about religion that's reemerging. And I think the continent is behind, but also interestingly spiritually restless after the demise of communism, which obviously is at this point, I think, a completely passé option. But you haven't had anything reemerge other than we'd call it a generally like kind of a liberal materialism. And so I think, philosophers tend to be in some way idealistic people, at least if they want to understand the world. They often also want to figure out how one ought to live wisely. And just living in the context of a market exchange system of entertainments and distractions isn't typically considered a noble goal of life, although it seems that that's where the modern universities settled for the moment. So I do think that when you offer a strongly thought out alternative to that, maybe a variegated one conceptually, where you have different intellectual perspectives philosophically and theologically of different schools of thought, you are offering in a complex way, you're presenting an opportunity to rethink our most fundamental orientations. And I would say I think people who have religious orientations can easily be discouraged in the contemporary moment, where it seems like the culture is largely disinterested or distracted from deeper questions about God or transcendence or spiritual orientation of the human person. And really, because of the COVID crisis, there's been a need to protect people, but on the same time, state has kind of swelled to this almost like maximal reference point for common culture. And so a lot of times people are sort of discouraged by it, but I think there's also a certain superficiality culturally to the secularism around us. And I think the difference between secular people and religious people intellectually has narrowed in terms of trying to understand themselves in our strange cosmos and the meaning of their lives. So I think putting on a conference where you have a kind of a focused and disciplined, might say, well, intellectually variegated approach to the question of God in the contemporary academy is timely and perhaps propedeutic to allowing and facilitating the reemergence of real religious seeking in our culture today.
Yeah. And so you're going to be a speaker at the conference, and as you point out, there's just a varied speaker list, all major international speakers, authors, people who work in this area. Can you give us a wee bit of an insight into what your contribution to the conference will be?
Well, the truth is I'm not certain yet, but I'm thinking of one or two things which are both worth mentioning. It might be neither of these things, but I mean, one thing I'm thinking about is what it means for theology to present itself as a science, as was the case in the Middle Ages, within the context of the contemporary university landscape. And although it might seem at first that you'd want to say, well, of course, that's very daring, if not impossible, because of the, let's just say, sociological exile of theology from the contemporary university. The other problem is that the contemporary secular university is hard-pressed to articulate itself as presenting a true universal vision of life, and therefore real, you might say, explanatory wisdom or science of being, or a certain vision of reality, because of the, you might say, just massive methodological heterogeneity that predominates, as well as the kind of predominance of the servile arts, as Newman called them in the contemporary university, which are basically practical over speculative. So I think actually the sort of scientific aspiration of classical theology can help at least challenge the university, if not revive the university in its aspiration to true universality. So that's a rather methodological point, but I'm thinking about talking about that. I have another idea, though, which is about the philosophical presuppositions of Orthodox Christology. Because I think for Christians to confess that God has become human, that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, that he is the second person of the Trinity, often it definitely obliges us to think out what are some philosophical truths about the human person compatible with that set of claims. Meaning, what are the natural rational correspondent claims we must make if Christology and the Orthodox understanding of it is true? And one of the things we could talk about is the centrality of personhood in a vision of what is most important in reality. Another thing we can talk about is that there are human natures. The human nature of the human persons have a nature that is not merely biologically material, although also that, and perhaps highly evolved in its cosmic history, but also in some ways a nature that has a spiritual and irreducibly immaterial dimension to it. And so what would it mean to confess theologically and argue philosophically for a robust conception of a spiritual and physical or hylomorphic conception of human nature, and of the primacy of personhood, as well as the intelligibility of the belief in God and there being a divine nature? Because to say Christ has a human nature and a divine nature means you have to say that there's a divine, that the concept of God having a nature is not that's not obvious, by the way. But that's an intelligible concept for human reason and not simply alien to human reason. I'm sort of playing around with those ideas.
Okay, they sound excellent. Well, finally then, I just want to ask, and it may be a bit left field, but it's more of a personal question. Are you looking forward or even excited about coming back to Ireland? And will you be bringing your banjo with you?
Okay, well, I'm excited to come back to Ireland. I mean, for lots of reasons. I mean, Americans always feel comfortable in Ireland, at least typically, and the Irish are very hospitable people, and it's a very wonderful place to visit, especially in spring. I mean, you have the healthiest air in the world and all that.
Right.
But then also, as you allude to, I like folk music. I mean, Irish folk music it's probably the greatest folk music tradition alive in the world today. It's, I think, undervalued. In contemporary Ireland, possibly. I mean, it's part of the cultural heritage of our world today that keeps us sane, to have these kinds of traditions of, you might call it organic and natural music that comes out of cultural that's so rich and robust. I don't play Irish music. I play in a bluegrass Americana band called the Hillbilly Thomists, which you can find on Spotify. We've just recorded a third album. It's kind of professional level stuff, I think. And, you know, there's Irish influence, but it's more, you know, influence from Kentucky, from blues a little bit, and from Americana folk music. So you can check that out we have a website too, Hillbilly Thomists, and you can see what kind of crazy music we do as Dominican priests when we're basically indulging in a hobby.
Excellent. Well, we very much look forward to having you over here in Ireland next year for the conference. So thanks very much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for taking the time for the interview.
That's all. Thank you.